You're holding a Society page headline from 1895 that reads like a fairy tale with a price tag, $160,000 to wed the imported French count. But that number was only the glitter on the surface. The real cost was closer to $10 million, 11 years, and a public slow-motion humiliation that turned an American heiress into Europe's most expensive lesson. Anna Gould did not marry poverty. She married entitlement dressed as elegance. How did a title become a trap door? And why did high society cheer while her fortune burned in plain sight? To understand why Anna Gould's marriage could devour millions, the lens has to widen beyond romance and into the machinery of the Gilded Age. In the late 1800s, American industry produced new money at a speed Europe could barely imagine. Railroads, speculation, and ruthless consolidation minted families whose wealth looked almost unreal on paper. But money on its own did not guarantee acceptance. In old money culture, legitimacy was still measured in accents, ancestry, and access. Who could be invited without explanation? Who could inherit prestige without proving anything at all? That is why the era invented a brutal exchange rate, American cash for European titles. The dollar princess was not a fairy tale heroine. She was a bridge. She carried millions across the Atlantic and returned with a name that sounded ancient even when the marriage behind it was modern and transactional. How did we get here, where a wedding could function like a merger? France had its own version of this economy. Aristocratic families possessed history, taste, and social authority, but many were financially brittle, magnificent facades supported by debts and the expectation that someone else would fund the illusion. And no illusion was more expensive than the illusion of effortless luxury. The press helped sustain it. Newspapers and society columns fed the public a steady diet of glamour, scandal, and moral judgment, especially aimed at women. A man who wasted money could still be a man of style. A woman who was wealthy became a target. Her face, her body, her desirability dissected as if her appearance was the interest rate on her fortune. That is why Anna Gould was uniquely vulnerable. Her name already carried the smell of controversy. She was the daughter of Jay Gould, the American tycoon so hated that his wealth felt illegitimate even when it was legal. His money could buy palaces, but it could not buy respect. And Anna's own looks became a public argument, a cruel shortcut for society to justify treating her as a purse rather than a person. Now add the final ingredient, the title-hungry aristocrat who understands attention the way a banker understands leverage. When a beautiful count with debt meets a young woman with millions and insecurity, who is courting whom? And what happens when the love story is really a business plan performed in ballrooms, priced in headlines, and paid for in silence? Anna Gould entered this story with a fortune large enough to distort reality. She was born in 1875 into the most combustible kind of American wealth, the kind made quickly, publicly, and with enemies attached. Her father, Jay Gould, had become a symbol of the robber baron era, a man who mastered railroads and markets with a cold intelligence that made the public furious. When he died in 1892, the inheritance he left his children was not only money, but an atmosphere, an invisible cloud of suspicion, envy, and fascination. Anna's share was reported in the millions, and the scale mattered because it changed what people saw when they looked at her. Old money society was trained to scan a woman the way it scanned a contract, for value, risk, and return. And if Anna had been the kind of heiress whose beauty made men forget arithmetic, the system might have treated her differently. But she wasn't. Contemporary commentary and later retellings repeatedly emphasized that the press and society did not consider her conventionally attractive. That detail is not gossip in this story. It is the trap mechanism. In a world where women were taught that marriage was their most legitimate achievement, being labeled unbeautiful was not merely an insult, it was a threat to survival. What happens when a young woman realizes that her wealth makes her desirable, but her body is treated like a flaw she must compensate for? That psychological pressure created the perfect opening for a man like Boniface de Castellane, known as Bony. He belonged to a French aristocratic family whose title carried centuries of prestige, but titles do not pay bills. And Boney's personality was built for the Gilded Age stage, charming, elegant, theatrical, and obsessively devoted to taste. He was the kind of man who understood how to make luxury look natural, as if money were not spent but simply appeared around him. Yet behind the elegance lived a core hunger that old money often hides behind manners: entitlement. Not the loud entitlement of crude thieves, but the refined entitlement of people who believe the world owes them a certain level of beauty, comfort, and admiration. Here is where the story becomes less about an unlucky marriage and more about a predictable collision. Anna needed legitimacy. Boney needed funding. Anna wanted to be chosen. Boney wanted access. The courtship unfolded like a performance where both parties believed they were directing the outcome. Anna could tell herself she had secured a romantic victory, a titled husband, a passport into Europe's highest rooms, a proof to the world that she was desired, not merely rich. Boney could tell himself he had secured the perfect patron, an heiress whose money could finance an entire lifestyle, a living treasury that could be converted into architecture, parties, jewels, and the kind of social dominance that debt alone could never purchase. Were these red flags ignored because of love, or because both sides were trying to escape something? The engagement itself contained a quiet warning. Anna reportedly had been engaged before, and the shift toward Boney suggested a familiar Gilded Age pattern, the power of a title to override a safer choice. In a society that treated marriage like social proof, the count label mattered more than character. The wedding became a headline, and headlines create momentum. Once the world is watching, the decision becomes harder to reverse, because backing out would be public failure. What happened next was not simply a marriage, it was a contract signed with applause. Immediately, the pressures of the arrangement began to surface. Anna's fortune was immense, but it was also vulnerable because it was new and therefore poorly protected by old-world instincts. Families like hers had money, but not necessarily the European legal strategies and social defenses that aristocrats used to preserve power. Boney, meanwhile, understood the rules of prestige. He knew that the appearance of wealth could be more important than wealth itself. Spending was not merely consumption, it was messaging. Each object, each dinner, each architectural decision declared a story, that the Castellane household was not fading, not desperate, not dependent. Never mind that it was. How does a fortune make someone vulnerable? It does not only attract thieves, it attracts people who can justify taking while calling it culture. And Anna's insecurity made her even easier target. If the world mocked her looks, then she might believe she needed to buy admiration through grandeur, through becoming the wife who could host the most stunning parties, live in the most breathtaking rooms, and wear the kind of jewelry that made criticism feel small. But that strategy contains poison. It shifts the goalposts endlessly, because once luxury is used as armor, the armor must keep growing or the fear returns. Boney sensed that. He could promise that more beauty, more marble, more gold, more spectacle would finally produce the respect Anna craved. In reality, it produced dependence. Not financial dependence, but emotional dependence on his approval and his taste. This is the foundation of the tragedy. Anna's wealth was treated as communal property by the people around her, while her dignity was treated as optional. In a just world, a husband protects his wife from exploitation. In this world, the husband becomes the most elegant exploiter in the room, and because he looks like a prince while doing it, society calls it romance. What happens when a woman realizes the man she married loves her fortune the way an artist loves paint, something to be used until it runs out? And when the first millions disappear, does love become louder, or does the truth finally begin to speak?
The breakdown begins the moment a fortune stops being a safety net and becomes fuel. After the wedding, Boney did not behave like a husband who had secured stability. He behaved like a man who had finally unlocked his true life. Money was no longer something to manage, it was something to stage. And his greatest stage was architecture, because a building can turn spending into permanence, turning cash into stone, turning a private obsession into a public monument. That monument became the Palais Rose, a Versailles-inspired fantasy built not to shelter a family, but to announce superiority. The palace itself functioned like a billboard, telling Paris that the Castellane name still belonged among the elite. But the problem with building a billboard out of someone else's money is that it requires continuous feeding. What happened next was not a single extravagant project, but a lifestyle designed to consume. Boney's tastes were famously exacting. Exacting taste can look like genius when it's funded. It looks like cruelty when the funding is a person. Rooms were decorated and redecorated. Objects were purchased for status rather than use. Parties were engineered as social warfare, a way to force society to surrender. Guests weren't invited merely to celebrate, they were invited to witness. In that world, Anna's role was not wife, not partner, not equal. She became a sponsor wearing a title. Even her humiliation could be reframed as elegance, because in old money culture, suffering silently is considered proof of breeding. How did we get here, where a woman's silence is treated as good manners while a man's spending is treated as art? Then came the private scandals that old money often pretends are tastefully handled. Boney's affairs, according to repeated accounts and the way the story is told in this genre, were not discrete accidents. They were a pattern. And the cruelty of the pattern is not only betrayal, it is the implication behind it, that the wife who pays is not the wife who is cherished. Anna was expected to tolerate the insult as part of the package: title, palace, humiliation, all bundled together. The press, which had mocked her appearance, now had a new product, the rich American heiress being used as a wallet by a glamorous French count. The audience could condemn and consume at the same time. What does a society reveal about itself when it can't look away from a woman's degradation, but refuses to intervene? Meanwhile, the practical consequences of the spending became harder to hide. In stories like this, there is always a moment where the fantasy cracks in a banal, almost comic way, because reality doesn't arrive with trumpets, it arrives with bills. One day it is marble and music. The next day it is the mundane humiliations of debt, delayed payments, creditors, services threatened, the public embarrassment of being unable to sustain the myth. In some retellings, the scandal becomes so sharp it turns absurd. Luxury interrupted by something as petty as electricity, as if even electricity refuses to endorse the performance. The point isn't the specific invoice. The point is that the entire lifestyle was structured around denial. It insisted that money was infinite, that reputation could be purchased, that taste could excuse exploitation. But money is never infinite, and exploitation always leaves traces. As the marriage deteriorated, so did the central illusion that being Countess de Castellane was the ultimate victory. Anna's wealth had bought her entry into the rooms she wanted, but inside those rooms she discovered a brutal truth. Entry is not belonging. The same society that welcomed her money could still despise her origins, and the same husband who displayed her fortune could still look down on her. This is where the breakdown becomes psychological. Wealth was supposed to grant control, but Anna's life demonstrated the opposite. Money without control becomes vulnerability. How does a woman reclaim control when the world has already decided what she is? An heiress, a dowry, a spectacle. The turning point comes when humiliation collides with arithmetic. By the end of the marriage, estimates in this narrative often point to losses so large they stop feeling like numbers and start feeling like time stolen. The about $10 million figure isn't merely a financial total, it is a measurement of years sacrificed to prove worth to people who benefit from doubt. It is the cost of believing that grandeur could protect dignity. Once the marriage reaches the legal and social breaking point, the story shifts from spectacle to strategy. Divorce in that era was not simply personal, it was political. It threatened reputations, inheritances, Catholic constraints, and family alliances. Men like Boney often attempted to keep control through institutions, lawyers, churches, social pressure, because when money begins to slip away, power tries to replace it. And yet, this is where Anna's most underestimated trait becomes visible: endurance. The same woman mocked as the ugly duckling begins to act like a survivor who finally sees the rules clearly. She begins to cut the fuel line. She begins to separate herself from the narrative that says she must keep paying to keep her title. The marriage collapses, but the collapse reveals something valuable. When the system expects a woman to remain a sponsor forever, the most radical act is to stop funding her own humiliation. So the question at the end of this breakdown is not only how the palace was built or how the money disappeared. The real question is, what happens after a woman survives the most expensive mistake of her era? Does she remain a cautionary tale, or does she find a way to turn the wreckage into a new kind of power? And if she can, what does that say about every modern story where wealth and romance are still used as weapons?
When Anna Gould's story is placed beside other old money tragedies, a pattern emerges that feels less like romance gone wrong and more like a repeatable system. Jenny Jerome was chased by rumors that turned her private life into a public marketplace. The scandal itself became a kind of currency that bought attention and proximity to power. Gladys Deacon was praised as a living ideal and then punished when that ideal cracked. Her beauty treated like a public asset, her suffering treated like a private embarrassment. Arabella Huntington proved that even when a woman converts wealth into institutions, she can still be judged as not born right, as if achievement can never fully compensate for origin. Anna's case sits at the center of this mechanism because it shows the raw exchange rate in its simplest form: money for title, dignity for admission, silence for survival. What happened next when these bargains became normalized across an entire era? The first consequence is economic, but not in the way people assume. Old money doesn't only preserve wealth, it preserves hierarchy. When European aristocrats married American heiresses, they did not merely accept new money, they absorbed it, converted it into estates, reputations, and cultural dominance, and then taught the public to believe the old class remained naturally superior. Anna's millions didn't disrupt the social order, they reinforced it by funding the illusion that the order deserved to exist. That is why the Palais Rose matters beyond architecture. It is a symbol of cash transformed into legitimacy, the way a modern brand converts money into influence through image. How did we get here, where image becomes the real product and the person becomes the financing plan? The second consequence is gendered. The era's double standard worked like a machine. Men could be extravagant, unfaithful, even cruel, and still be framed as charismatic. Women were expected to endure, to be grateful, to treat suffering as sophistication. Anna was mocked for her appearance, then blamed for not keeping a husband who was never trying to be kept. This is not merely personal cruelty, it is a social rule that makes exploitation look normal. And the press was not a bystander, it was the amplifier. By turning Anna into a punchline and Boney into a glamorous villain, it sold the public a morality play while feeding the very appetite that kept the hierarchy alive. The third consequence reaches straight into the present. Today's luxury flex culture, mansions used as content, parties staged for cameras, relationships treated like status objects, runs on the same fuel. Swap society columns for algorithms, aristocratic salons for influencer circles, and the mechanism is almost identical. Attention rewards spectacle, spectacle invites exploitation, and money becomes a prop for someone else's story. The question is not whether Anna Gould's tragedy could happen again, the question is whether it already is, only faster, louder, and with more people cheering from the sidelines. Has anything really changed except the speed at which humiliation becomes entertainment? Anna Gould's story offers lessons that are uncomfortable precisely because they are practical. The first is financial autonomy with real firewalls. Wealth is not power if someone else controls the narrative of how it must be spent. In modern terms, that means separate assets, independent advisors, legal protections, and contracts that anticipate the exact scenario old money pretends never happens. A spouse who treats marriage like a funding stream. A fortune should never be allowed to become a partner's personal budget without oversight. What happened next in Anna's life only became possible when the fuel line was cut, when spending stopped being romantic and started being recognized as extraction. The second lesson is social literacy. Old money is rarely defeated by emotion, it is defeated by understanding the rules. Titles and glamour can function like camouflage, hiding debt, addiction to admiration, and entitlement behind taste. A young heiress does not need more compliments about the beauty of a palace. She needs someone willing to ask, who benefits from this? And what does this cost in control? Were the red flags ignored because of love, or because society trained women to believe love must be proved by sacrifice? Third is the ethical lesson for the audience and the press. Anna was mocked for her appearance and reduced to a dowry in human form, which made exploitation feel deserved. That logic still exists today whenever people treat a woman's body as permission to dehumanize her story. If scandal is profitable, media will keep manufacturing it. The only long-term correction is refusing to reward cruelty with attention. Finally, there is the legacy lesson. The opposite of conspicuous consumption is not austerity, it is purpose. Old money becomes less toxic when wealth is redirected toward durability, libraries, education, preservation, public good. A palace built to impress will eventually disappear. A life built to matter leaves traces that gossip cannot erase. Anna Gould's tragedy is not that she spent too much. It is that an entire prestige culture taught her the wrong equation, that humiliation is the entry fee for acceptance, that a title can compensate for contempt, that a palace can substitute for safety. The Palais Rose looked like permanence, but it was built on a fragile foundation, one woman's need to be valued and one man's belief that he deserved to consume her fortune in the name of taste. In the end, the most shocking detail isn't the millions. It's how predictable the pattern is when money meets entitlement, and society calls it romance. Old money can buy marble, chandeliers, and headlines. It cannot buy respect where respect was never intended to be given. If this story changed how you see wealth, status, and the price women are expected to pay for belonging, subscribe for more old money cases where the truth behind the glamour is darker than the gossip. Share this video with someone who thinks luxury is always a dream, and leave a comment. If you were Anna Gould, where would you have drawn the line? Before the palace, before the first betrayal, or only when the bill finally arrived? And one more question, because it's the one that matters now. When modern culture rewards spectacle with applause, who is paying for the show?